In the summer of 1858, two warships met in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 1,600 nautical miles from the nearest port in either direction. Sailors on the deck of the Agamemnon lowered a spliced copper wire into water that was, at that exact point, more than 2 miles deep. Nobody on board had ever seen the ocean floor they were about to bury a message line into. 3 weeks later, on the 16th of August, Queen Victoria's 98-word greeting to the President of the United States took almost 16 hours to cross that wire. And within a month, the whole thing went silent. Forever, everyone assumed. They were wrong, but it would take 8 more years, one bankrupt company, one grappling hook lost at the bottom of the sea, and the largest ship human beings had ever built to prove it. Here's the strange part. By the 1850s, a message could travel from New York to New Orleans in minutes. Wires strung on wooden poles carried news across entire continents almost as fast as a person could think it. So why did a gap of roughly 2,000 miles of open ocean feel like an unsolvable problem? Why did some of the smartest engineers in Britain and America spend 12 years, several fortunes, and an almost comic number of failed attempts just to connect two coastlines that were already, technologically speaking, wired for instant communication on their own soil? And why, when you ask most people today how the internet actually crosses the Atlantic, do they have no idea that the answer starts with a Victorian telegraph company and a ship nicknamed the Great Babe? That's what we're unpacking today. Not just what happened, but why laying a wire across an ocean floor turned out to be one of the strangest engineering problems of the entire 19th century. By the middle of the 1850s, the telegraph was no longer a novelty. It was infrastructure. Lines crossed much of the United States and nearly all of Britain, carrying news, business orders, and personal messages over thousands of miles of poles and wire almost instantly. This was the first time in human history that information could travel faster than a horse, a ship, or a train. Governments used it. Newspapers depended on it. Merchants built entire businesses around the minutes it saved them. And that success is exactly what made the ocean gap so infuriating. On land, a message could cross a continent in the time it took to boil a kettle. But the moment that same message needed to cross open water to reach another continent, it had to go back to 1854 technology. A physical letter, loaded onto a ship, sailing for around 10 days before anyone on the other side even knew it existed. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was two completely different centuries operating a few hundred miles apart, separated only by the Atlantic. So what exactly stood in the way? Distance, first. Nearly 2,000 miles of open water between Ireland and Newfoundland, over 6 times longer than any submarine cable ever laid before this project began. Depth, second. The ocean floor along the proposed route dropped to more than 3,000 meters in places, depths nobody had any real way to survey accurately in the 1850s, and which were, at the time, hopefully described as a flat, gentle telegraphic plateau. It was not entirely flat, and it was not entirely gentle. And then there was money. Businesses on both sides of the Atlantic were losing enormous amounts of time, and therefore profit, waiting between 8 and 10 days for information to physically sail across. A ship collision, a market shift, a war update, all of it arrived stale by the time anyone read it. One New York paper manufacturer, a man named Cyrus Field, looked at that gap and saw something most engineers of his era considered borderline delusional. Not a shipping problem, but a wiring problem. He had almost no background in telegraphy. What he had was money, stubbornness, and a willingness to fail in public, repeatedly, which, as we're about to see, he absolutely did. The problem was simple to describe and brutal to solve. Get a continuous, unbroken wire from Ireland to Newfoundland without it snapping under its own weight, corroding in seawater, or losing its signal over a distance no cable had ever attempted before. The solution Field and his partners settled on was a copper core wrapped in gutta percha insulation, a rubber-like tree sap already used in shorter submarine lines. Armored with iron wire, coiled onto the decks of two warships, HMS Agamemnon and USS Niagara, because no single ship of the era could carry the full length in one hold. Loading that cable alone took around 3 weeks, watched by crowds and celebrated with dinners before a single mile had touched the water. Then came the record-setting failure. During the very first attempt, in August of 1857, the cable snapped and was lost after only a few hundred miles had been paid out from the coast of Ireland, swallowed by an ocean whose depth they still couldn't reliably measure. The expedition turned back, having proven only one thing. They now owned a very expensive lesson in how much force open ocean puts on a thin copper wire. Today, almost nothing physical survives from this first attempt. No salvaged cable, no preserved ship. But its failure directly rewrote the specifications for every attempt that followed, including one that would come far closer to succeeding within the very same year. The problem this time wasn't getting the cable across, it was keeping it alive once it got there. After the 1857 failure, the two ships tried again in June of 1858, suffered 3 more breaks, and finally, on the 29th of July, spliced their cables together in the middle of the ocean and sailed in opposite directions. It worked. Both ends reached land within a day of each other in early August. The solution, on paper, was simply patience and better cable handling. But the deeper technical solution, the one nobody had truly solved yet, was how to send a readable signal down 2,000 miles of wire without it blurring into static. Here's the number that matters. Despite everyone believing this cable barely functioned, it carried around 732 messages in its short working life, including news of a ship collision and an order from the British government recalling troop movements. Then came the fatal decision. The company's chief electrician, a man named Wildman Whitehouse, believed that pushing higher voltage through the line would push the signal through faster. He was wrong, and worse, the higher voltage physically damaged the cable's insulation from the inside. Within about a month of that triumphant first message, the line went completely dead. A public inquiry followed, and Whitehouse took the blame in the press, while a physicist named William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, had already been arguing that the fix wasn't more power, it was more sensitivity, a way to detect much fainter signals instead of forcing stronger ones through fragile wire. That idea, the mirror galvanometer, would become the single most important piece of engineering in every attempt that came after. What's left of the 1858 cable itself today is essentially nothing recoverable. It sits wherever it failed, buried under a century and a half of sediment. But Thomson's instrument-based approach to weak signals became the technical seed for the entire next chapter of this story. By the mid-1860s, the engineers chasing this problem had figured out something the first 2 attempts never addressed directly. The cable kept breaking, partly because it was being handled by 2 separate ships that had to meet, splice, and diverge in open ocean. A delicate, failure-prone maneuver performed with 1850s equipment on a moving sea. The solution wasn't a better splice. It was removing the splice entirely, which meant finding one ship big enough to carry the entire cable in a single hold. Only one vessel on Earth could do that. The Great Eastern, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel and launched in 1858, was, at the time, the largest ship ever built. 692 feet long, with a gross tonnage of nearly 19,000, originally designed to carry up to 4,000 passengers to Australia without refueling. As a passenger liner, she was a commercial failure and spent years laid up, essentially unwanted. In 1864, a cable-laying company bought her for around $25,000, a fraction of what she cost to build, purely because her cargo holds were the only ones on the planet large enough to hold an entire ocean's worth of telegraph cable without a mid-sea splice. It's a striking piece of irony. A ship built for glamour and luxury travel, considered too enormous and impractical for its intended purpose, found its real calling as industrial cargo infrastructure. She would go on to lay more submarine cable across multiple oceans than any vessel of her era, but her first transatlantic attempt in this new role, in 1865, would turn into the most gut-wrenching failure of the entire saga. The problem this time wasn't the ship, and it wasn't the ocean crossing itself. It was one single flaw hiding somewhere inside 2,000 miles of freshly manufactured cable. The Great Eastern set off from Ireland on the 23rd of July, 1865, paying out cable smoothly for days. Then a fault appeared. The crew reversed the ship, hauled the cable back aboard, found the damaged section, cut it out, and kept going. 6 days later, another fault. Repaired again. Then, with roughly one-third of the journey to Newfoundland still ahead, a third fault was found. And this time, while the crew worked to bring the damaged section back on deck for testing, the cable simply snapped and vanished over the side, into water estimated at around 2,000 fathoms deep, somewhere in the range of 2 miles straight down. Here's the almost absurd part. They tried to get it back. For roughly 3 weeks, using grappling hooks dragged along a seafloor nobody had ever mapped, the crew attempted to snag a wire barely thicker than a finger, lying somewhere across an area of open ocean the size of a small country, at a depth where no human-made object had ever been deliberately retrieved before. They failed. Running low on coal and rope, the Great Eastern turned back to Britain empty-handed, having marked the approximate location and nothing more. It's worth sitting with the scale of that failure for a second. An entire ocean crossing's worth of cable, manufacturing cost, and 18 months of preparation, reduced to a single snapped splice and a guess at coordinates on a chart. And yet, this expedition proved something crucial, that the Great Eastern herself could reliably carry and lay cable across the full distance without a mid-ocean splice. The wire was gone. The method wasn't. The problem now had 2 parts, and either one alone would have been remarkable to solve. First, lay an entirely new cable using everything learned from the 1865 disaster. Second, almost as an afterthought, but not really, go back and try to find last year's lost cable at the bottom of the ocean and finish the job with that one too. The Great Eastern left Ireland again in July of 1866, and this time the crossing went essentially without major incident. 2 weeks after departure, the cable reached Newfoundland, and the connection was live. On its very first day of commercial operation, the 27th of July, the new line brought in about £1,000 in message charges. A striking number when you remember that 10 years earlier, sending any message across the Atlantic meant a 10-day wait with no charge at all, because the option simply didn't exist. Then came the truly remarkable part. The crew turned the ship around, sailed back out over the open Atlantic, and spent roughly 3 more weeks dragging grappling gear across the seafloor, searching for a cable that had been lying at extreme depth, untouched, for a full year. They found it. They hauled the recovered end aboard, spliced it to fresh cable, and completed the 1865 line as well. By the end of that summer, there were 2 fully functioning telegraph cables connecting Europe and North America, with a combined length of around 1,686 nautical miles. What had been, a decade earlier, a project many serious engineers considered close to impossible, was now, suddenly, redundant, doubled, with a spare. Success didn't mean the technology stood still. If anything, 1866 was the starting gun for a slow, decades-long replacement race. The copper and gutta-percha telegraph cable of the 1860s was, by any modern standard, painfully limited. A handful of words per minute, one signal at a time, readable only by trained operators watching a needle or a mirror flicker. Engineers spent the following decades squeezing more out of that same basic wire: better insulation, duplex signaling that let messages travel in both directions on one line, and steadily improving accuracy. But the format itself, dots and dashes crawling across an ocean floor, had a ceiling. The first real challenge to that format wasn't another cable at all, it was radio. In 1927, a commercial transatlantic radio telephone service opened, letting people actually speak across the ocean for the first time, at a price of roughly £9 for 3 minutes, a sum far beyond ordinary households. Radio was faster to establish than a physical cable, but it was also unreliable, vulnerable to atmospheric interference, and offered no privacy at all. It took until 1956 for the first actual transatlantic telephone cable, known as TAT-1, to finally go into service, using coaxial copper wire and vacuum tube repeaters to carry 36 simultaneous voice circuits between Scotland and Newfoundland. 100 years, almost to the moment, after Cyrus Field first raised money for his impossible idea. It was a genuine leap. It was also, compared to what was coming, barely a beginning. If a physical cable was ever going to become old news, most people in the 1950s assumed the challenger would be radio. Instead, it was something far stranger, a metal sphere the size of a large beach ball, orbiting the Earth every 158 minutes. In July of 1962, a satellite named Telstar, weighing about 77 kilograms and funded largely by a private telephone company, relayed the first live transatlantic television signal. Footage that reached ground stations in Maine and France within hours of launch. For a moment, it looked like cables might become irrelevant entirely. No wire, no ship, no ocean floor, just a signal bounced off an object in space. But Telstar's limitations were almost as dramatic as its triumph. Its orbit meant it was only visible to both continents at once for about 18 minutes at a time, and by November of that same year, radiation had already damaged its electronics. It went fully silent within about 7 months of launch. Satellites turned out to be brilliant for live broadcasts and terrible for the steady, high-volume, low-delay traffic that phone calls and, eventually, computer data required. So cables came back, but transformed. In 1988, a new transatlantic line called TAT-8 went into service, and this one used no copper at all. It carried light, pulsed through hair-thin strands of glass fiber at a capacity equivalent to about 40,000 simultaneous phone circuits, roughly 10 times what the last copper-based cable had managed. That was the real end of the era this story began in. Not a bigger battery, not a smarter relay, an entirely different physical medium, doing the same job a Victorian gutta-percha wire had once done, at a scale nobody in 1858 could have conceived of. Today's transatlantic internet cables are the direct descendants of TAT-8, not of Telstar. The wire won in the end. It just had to become light to do it. Cyrus Field, the paper manufacturer with no telegraphy background, who refused to let 2 public failures stop him, did eventually get his celebration. Honors, medals, and international recognition followed the success of 1866. It did not last. Field spent his later years chasing other ventures, including elevated railways in New York, and lost his entire fortune to a series of bad investments. He died bankrupt in July of 1892, at the age of 72, in Irvington, New York. A strange, quiet ending for a man whose name had once been printed in newspapers on both sides of an ocean he'd successfully wired together. William Thomson fared better. His mirror galvanometer and his broader work on signal transmission became foundational to the entire field of electrical engineering, and he was later ennobled as Lord Kelvin, a title that recognized, among other achievements, his contributions to exactly the kind of long-distance signal problem this project had forced him to solve. The Great Eastern, the ship too large for her original purpose and perfectly suited to her second one, went on to lay several more submarine cables across multiple oceans through the 1860s and 70s before being laid up again, used briefly as a floating advertising billboard for a department store, and finally scrapped in 1889 and 1890. As for the physical link itself, the original cable landing points still exist. Heart's Content in Newfoundland, where the 1866 cable first came ashore, operated continuously as a working cable station until 1965, and is preserved today as a heritage site alongside its sister station on Valentia Island in Ireland. Two small, easy-to-miss buildings on opposite coastlines that quietly represent one of the more improbable engineering achievements of their century. Here's the thing worth carrying with you. Right now, whatever device you're watching this on, if it's connected to anything on another continent, that connection is almost certainly still running through a physical cable lying on an ocean floor. Not a satellite, not the cloud in any literal sense, but a wire, thinner than you'd expect, buried in silt at a depth most of us will never see. The technology inside that wire has changed almost beyond recognition. Light instead of electricity, glass instead of copper, terabits instead of a handful of words per hour. But the fundamental, slightly absurd premise hasn't changed at all. Someone still has to get a continuous line across an entire ocean, keep it intact under enormous pressure, and trust that a signal sent from one side will actually arrive readable on the other. The next time a video call connects instantly to someone on a different continent, or a web page loads from a server you'll never see, it's worth remembering that the idea of doing this at all was, within living memory of people alive in 1857, considered close to delusional. It took a paper manufacturer with no technical training, a ship built for a completely different purpose, and one absolutely brutal failure at the bottom of the ocean to prove it could be done even once. Everything since has just been refinement. If this kind of forgotten, unglamorous engineering history is your thing, subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this one buried in plain sight. And here's a real question for the comments, not just what did you think? What's another everyday piece of infrastructure you walk past, drive over, or rely on constantly that has a similarly wild origin story? Something like a sewer system, a power grid, or a rail tunnel that you'd want broken down like this? Drop it below, and if you made it this far, a like genuinely helps this kind of deep dive reach more people who'd enjoy it too.